The Gallic War is perhaps the most well-documented conflict of the Roman Republic, thanks in no small part to the thorough commentaries provided by Julius Caesar himself. Because the original work still exists, and we also have surviving histories of the war from historians like Plutarch and Suetonius, we have a unique window into the major players and movements of the era that, sadly, we don't get for other conflicts. It is from my readings of Caesar's commentaries, as well as Plutarch's Fall of the Roman Republic and Suetonius's The 12 Caesars, that I now proudly present to you the top 5 villains of the Gallic War.
What about Julius Caesar? Didn't Caesar genocide the Gauls? Gallic culture had
Weren't
value
the
and shouldn't
Gauls
be
the
denigrated.
victims?
Wasn't Caesar
Didn't
the bad
Caesar
guy?
take
Wasn't
1
the whole
million
Gallic
Gallic
War
slaves?
just a
Wasn't
propaganda
Caesar a
move from
tyrant
Caesar?
who ended the
Dan
Republic?
Carlin told me Julius Caesar was Darth Vader, so now I think Julius Caesar is bad.
Number 5. Dumnorix. Starting off with one of the lesser-known antagonists of the Gallic War. Dumnorix was no general, and he never led an army against Julius Caesar, nor even faced him a single time in battle. So who even was this guy, and why is he here? Dumnorix was a high-ranking member of the Aedui tribe, one of the Celtic tribes closely allied with Rome, and the younger brother of the chief magistrate, Diviciacus. Diviciacus had been instrumental in aiding the Romans in their battles against both the migrating Helvetii and the rampaging Suebi. Behind the scenes, however, constantly working to undermine his efforts, was Dumnorix, and he almost succeeded in splitting the Aedui state in two. The first mention we get of Dumnorix is very early on in Caesar's commentaries, as one of the main conspirators involved in the plot to resettle the entire Helvetii state far to the west. The Helvetii were a tribe led by a man named Orgetorix, and to seal their alliance, Dumnorix took Orgetorix's daughter as his wife. Despite the fact that Orgetorix was captured, and, Caesar implies, forcefully suicided, the Helvetii nevertheless carried out his original plan, and began their doomed western migration. After the advance of the Helvetii was refused and subsequently rebuffed by Caesar, it was Dumnorix who negotiated with the Sequani tribe in order to allow the Helvetii passage through their lands, so they could get to their intended destination. The two tribes came to an agreement, and the Helvetii began to approach the lands of the Aedui, Ambari, and Allobroges, all of whom were directly allied with Rome. It was when Caesar set out to pursue the Helvetii that Dumnorix decided to act. Using his position of influence in Aeduan society, he prevented critical grain shipments from reaching the Roman legions, forcing Caesar to reevaluate his strategy in the campaign. Eventually, however, news of Dumnorix's attempts at sabotage came to Caesar, and, though he would have had him killed, was convinced by Diviciacus to spare his life and keep him under guard instead. 4 years later, when Caesar was preparing for his second crossing to Britain, Dumnorix was summoned to accompany the Romans across, as Caesar did not want to leave adjutants in Gaul to their own devices while he was out of the country. Dumnorix heavily protested, first claiming a fear of the sea, then religious duties, as reasons he could not make the crossing. When these failed to convince Caesar, Dumnorix began shouting that Caesar was planning to take the Gallic chieftains across the English Channel in order to have them killed in secret. At last, Dumnorix convinced the Aeduan cavalry who were sent to accompany Caesar to return home, which was the last straw for the proconsul. He sent his own men to convince the cavalry to return, and told them that if Dumnorix resisted, he was to be killed. Predictably, Dumnorix did resist, and was killed after a short skirmish. The Aeduan cavalry then returned to Caesar's side without protest. Number 4. Indutio Maris. A member of the Treveri tribe, Indutio Maris is often overshadowed by his much more infamous and effective contemporary, Ambiorix, who, spoiler alert, will be appearing later on this list. Caesar first mentions Indutio Maris as one of 2 men competing for supreme power over the Treveri tribe in 54 BC. When the Treveri had failed to attend several consecutive assemblies between Gallic leadership and the Romans, Caesar decided he would march to the Treveri and uncover exactly what was happening in their state. Cingetorix, the man with whom Indutiomarus was battling for kingship over the Treveri, approached Caesar first, and promised to uphold his friendship to the Roman people if Caesar would support him. Caesar, not wanting to waste time campaigning against the Treveri, agreed, and Indutiomarus quickly capitulated, ceding his right to rule, along with 200 hostages, to Caesar. This, however, was not the end for Indutiomarus. Not willing to settle with the terms he'd agreed to, he began to secretly approach Germans living across the Rhine, and rouse several of his dependents in order to usurp power. His chance finally came later that year. While Ambiorix was busy fighting against Cicero, Indutiomarus made his move. He expelled Cingetorix from Treveri lands and seized his property, then marched on a Roman camp led by Titus Labienus, Caesar's second in command. This put Caesar in a difficult position. He was counting on having Labienus and his troops join him in relieving the siege of Cicero's camp, but because of the actions of Indutiomarus and his supporters, he was forced to make do with the 2 legions he had on hand. Fortunately for Labienus, however, Indutiomarus fell into the most common trap the Romans set for the Gauls during the course of the entire campaign, pretending to be short-manned and afraid, baiting the Gauls in close, then surprising them with a sudden sortie from the gates of their camp. In the end, Indutiomarus was killed fleeing from the battle in the shallows of a river, and his head was brought back to Labienus, ending his short-lived revolt. Number 3. Convictolitavus and Litavicus. Coming in at number 3 is a 2-for-1, and we're going back to the Aedui this time, in the year 52 BC, during the revolt of Vercingetorix. While the Aedui were still counted among Caesar's closest allies going into the Great Revolt, not all was well in their state. A power struggle had emerged for the magistracy of the Aedui, and 2 men had come out on top, Convictolitavus and Cottus. An emissary from the Aedui came to Caesar during the campaign against Gergovia, warning him that their state was poised to be split in 2, and Caesar knew that if this happened, many of the Aedui were likely to seek out an alliance with Vercingetorix for support. Caesar agreed to mediate this dispute, and, upon finding out that Cottus's brother had previously held the magistracy, thus making Cottus himself ineligible for the office by Aeduan law, he conferred the office to Convictolitavus, who renewed his promise of friendship to Rome. No sooner had Caesar left Bibracte than did Convictolitavus begin to scheme and plot against his benefactor. He was presented with an enormous bribe by the Arverni, and convinced that if the Aedui were to abandon Caesar, then the Romans would be left with no support in Gaul and would be forced to retreat. Easily fooled, Convictolitavus approached Litavicus and his brothers, who were of noble family, and shared the bribe with them. He then put Litavicus in charge of 10,000 men, who were ostensibly being sent to aid Caesar at Gergovia, and it was when he drew close to the legions that Litavicus chose to strike. He called to his soldiers, informing them that the Romans had betrayed the Aedui and massacred their leadership and cavalry. Litavicus then pointed at the Roman citizens who had been living among and currently traveling with the Aedui, and ordered them tortured and slain on the spot. Following this, he declared that the only hope for the Aedui was to set out for Gergovia and form an alliance with Vercingetorix. Caesar, however, learned of what was happening, and set out with 4 legions to meet this new threat, along with some of the Gallic cavalry who were, according to Litavicus, supposedly among those murdered by Caesar himself. The Aedui army realized that they had been deceived, but before Litavicus could be captured, he escaped with several of his supporters to the camp of Vercingetorix. Both Convictolitavus and Litavicus, however, were not done, and through deception managed to convince the Aedui state to support the Arverni, officially joining the war on the side of Vercingetorix shortly after the events at Gergovia. Caesar makes no mention of the fate of these 2 men after this, so what ultimately happened to them is unknown, but we can presume that they either were killed or fled during or after the Battle of Alesia. Number 2. Vercingetorix. Coming in second place is the person most people would probably consider Caesar's primary antagonist during the Gallic War. Vercingetorix gets a lot of respect, not just from historians, but from Caesar himself. Caesar recognized that Vercingetorix was a formidable foe, apt in wielding both the carrot and the stick to force other Gallic tribes to join his cause. Vercingetorix's rebellion almost didn't happen, as when he first began to rally men to his side, he was opposed by the Arverni leadership, and even expelled from Gergovia by his own uncle. Undeterred, Vercingetorix began rallying to his side many criminals and desperadoes, and was able to swell his ranks to such an extent that he returned to Gergovia and assumed control of the nascent rebellion. Those who resisted his call or wavered in joining his revolution were brutalized, tortured, and many were burned alive. Others were maimed and disfigured, and sent back to their people as a message to all those that would not fall in line. In the end, Vercingetorix managed to unite the majority of the Gallic states under a single banner. Vercingetorix faced Caesar at 3 events during the year 52 BC. The first at Avaricum, where his scorched earth tactics and emphasis on cavalry forced the Romans to privation, and were only saved by a surprise attack during a heavy rainstorm that took the Gauls off guard. Caesar comments that although this had been a great loss for Vercingetorix and the Gauls, his reputation was not harmed by the defeat, as he had been the only one to declare that Gallic resources should not be invested in the defense of Avaricum. The siege of Gergovia, which followed Avaricum, ended in a Roman withdrawal from the area, largely because of the interference and treachery of the Aedui, who we just got finished discussing. Although this was a minor victory for Vercingetorix, his fortunes were quickly reversed when he blundered a large cavalry force in an attempt to bring a permanent end to Caesar's army. Finally, at Alesia, a town of the Mandubi tribe, Vercingetorix was outmaneuvered and defeated after Caesar encircled both the city and Caesar's own army with 2 sets of walls. After this, Caesar actually pardoned much of the remaining army that Vercingetorix commanded, including those men of the Arverni and of the Aedui who had so recently betrayed him. Vercingetorix himself was taken prisoner, but because of the outbreak of civil war, would not be executed until 5 years after the Battle of Alesia. Number 1. Ambiorix. Some historians in the chat might be gasping for air that I put Ambiorix above Vercingetorix, but I think he deserves the number 1 spot, and here's why. At the end of 54 BC, after Caesar's second crossing of the Rhine, and his second expedition to Britannia, he found himself facing a unique set of circumstances. Due to the aggression of both the Belgae and the Germans, Caesar had found it necessary to increase the size of his standing army considerably. As such, his forces were now so significant that they could not be quartered in a single place for the winter without causing immense stress on the food supply of the local tribes. To combat this issue, Caesar decided to split his forces and station them throughout various parts of Gaul. 15 cohorts, or about 1.5 legions, were sent under the legates Quintus Sabinus and Lucius Cotta to winter in Belgae with the Eburones tribe, a smaller client tribe of the Treveri, who we talked about earlier. Only a few days after arriving, the Romans came under attack by a force led by Ambiorix, and after a brief exchange, a truce was called, and the Romans were invited to a parley with Ambiorix himself. Ambiorix told the Romans that a revolt was stirring in Gaul, and that he had been forced by oath to attack them, and that he was in great debt to Caesar for not only freeing him from a tribute he had to pay to the neighboring Aduatuci, but also for returning his son and nephew to him, that the Aduatuci had enslaved as well. Ambiorix convinced the delegates that all of Gaul had revolted, and that one of the nearby legions was under heavy attack. As a way of apology for the action he was forced to take, Ambiorix promised safe passage through his lands for the men under Sabinus and Cotta's command, so they could come to the aid of the besieged legion. I won't get into the details of Sabinus and Cotta's argument, but suffice it to say that Sabinus's view that they should trust Ambiorix and leave camp the following day won out, and from that moment, the fate of the 15 cohorts was sealed. The following day, as the legions moved through a valley, Ambiorix sprung his trap and massacred every last Roman he could find, including Sabinus and Cotta both. After this enormous victory, he convinced the Nervii, among a few other tribes, to march on another nearby Roman camp, led by Quintus Cicero. Cicero, however, was no fool, and was not about to fall for the same trap that Sabinus had. In a spectacular display of gallantry, Cicero managed to hold out against wave after wave of Gallic attacks until a message was finally relayed to Caesar, who rushed to Cicero's aid. Ambiorix's forces were summarily defeated by Caesar's much smaller army, and the Eburones themselves were condemned as unforgivable traitors. Ambiorix would escape capture multiple times, possibly over the Rhine and into Germanic territory. His deeds, however, inflicted an enormous blow to the Roman war effort, and for the first time Gauls had begun fighting like Romans, digging trenches and establishing siege works. Although it ended in failure, Ambiorix would pave the way for his vile kin to follow in his footsteps just 1 year later. Thank you for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, you can leave a like and subscribe. Who do you think was the most villainous Gaul or greatest traitor of the Gallic War? Let me know down in the comments.